Welcome to the MBA series. This is a special multi-part series within Next Economy Now. We are going to review the arc of the learning journey that is presented in the Next Economy MBA online course. We are open sourcing the content from our course and hope to share it in this shorter, bite-sized format. We are launching this series because we were asked to do it by listeners like you. We're also doing it because we are writing a book entitled The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life, which will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Barrett Kohler Publishers. This is a sizable series. There will eventually be 18 podcast episodes of course content and 9 interviews with MBA alumni. We will be rotating every other week with our normal Next Economy Now interview format. We hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to us via our website, lifteconomy.com, with any comments, feedback, or requests. And now, on with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to Next Economy Now, the MBA podcast series. This is episode 10, Vision Alignment. This is Kevin Bayou, co-worker, owner, partner at Lift Economy. I'm here with co-founder of Lift Economy.
Hey, everybody. Happy to be here. How you doing, Kevin? Excited to talk about vision alignment today.
Really well. Me too. A topic that near and dear to our heart, because what we find very frequently is that critical success factor, probably number one for Next Economy organizations, people with ambitions to provide goods and services that are needed for their community. But why does it not work? Where does it break down? And this is a really important topic. So, Sean, maybe you can elaborate. Why is an aligned vision important? What do we mean by that?
Well, Kevin, I'll start by what we mean and then kind of connect it to why. So what we mean by vision is how could we envision the future being different than it is today? How might the world be different because we're bringing our talents, we're manifesting, a certain product or service in the marketplace, and why? Why would we do this? What's the purpose? What's the reason? What's the impact? And how would the world be different in the future? And how would it look different? And why it's important is, well, of course, if we don't have a purpose, it's going to be really hard to tell if we're successful at all. And that sounds somewhat obvious, but as you said, this might be the single most critical factor in the success of the organization, because this is something we've seen, right, with consulting with small teams over the last decade, is it's often not as carefully aligned as we might think or want it to be. And one of the mistakes can be kind of assuming that we're more aligned than we are. Kevin's a cool guy. He seems pretty progressive. I saw what he did in his garden. He's got lots of perennials. He's always got some greens to eat. I'm assuming we're on the same page when we talk about a next economy that works for all life. And I might be partially correct, but if we don't actually kind of hash it out in the details, it's really risky, right? So, Kevin, have you ever seen it not work out?
Tragically, that's the more common scenario, is where a group will come together and say, hey, we want to start a co-op, or we want to start a Next Economy nonprofit enterprise or benefit corporation or something. We want to provide needed goods and services for our community, maybe around food security or renewable energy or something. And they'll start working together and just kind of assume implicitly that there's an alignment on what they want to see happen in the world. And maybe they'll even do well. They'll start, providing stuff for their community, generating reciprocity transactions, making a living. And there's somewhere along the road, there starts to be signs of like one of the persons in the group actually wants to emphasize this particular impact or another. And another one or two people in the group really want to emphasize, well, my needs are different in terms of the outcome. I'd rather get to a place where we could sell this company and make some money and then leverage that money to start something else or some other nuanced difference. And when it's kind of implicit nuanced differences, it can seem awkward to like step back and then really do some shared analysis of like what problems are there in the world, how do we see it together, what vision do we have for what it could be, and have those conversations, which for some people can seem really abstract or disconnected from the next step or the critical path and 30,000 foot or whatever. And so they actually just skip it. They don't have those conversations, which can be difficult but illuminating. And when those divergences start to show up, they start as like subtle conflicts of like, why does this person always do this? And like, now I'm not sure I trust them. And this other person is doing this other thing. And those micro conflicts start to build. And, you know, Sean, you asked the question in jest, I think, because we've seen how many organizations, when they erupt into significant conflict where it leads to separation or the end of the sustained ability to continue going, when we diagnose what happened, how did it get to that point, it's almost always implicated in a misalignment of what we want to achieve together, what we're oriented around.
Right. So there was like an implicit assumption it was going to go a certain way, but because it wasn't unpacked in detail, it's almost a surprise when it gets there. So what might we suggest instead of assuming we're mostly aligned, right?
Yeah. I think one of the keys is to actually have some process around making the implicit explicit. So it's been our observation that when people come to doing something together and collaborating together, there's oftentimes each person has their own individual vision that they want to have, what they want to see happen in the world, how they want to impact the world. And taking a moment to have a process where those visions, those individual visions, can be shared in a way where they can be compared and contrasted with each other. So oftentimes a facilitated endeavor, sometimes a retreat, or a series of conversations, ideally writing down, explicating, making it very in articulation that's detailed enough about what we want to see happen. And this is a delicate piece right here because in general, you could say that one of the barriers to people doing vision alignment is that the process of doing visioning, as a culture, globally, it's not encouraged. Like, what impact could be possible? What beneficial thing do you want to see happen in the world? So many of us are predisposed to see all the negatives or to not have flexed the kind of ideal vision of what could be possible. We either avoid doing personal visioning process, or in some cases we kind of have a fairly naive, not well considered, not rigorous kind of assessment of like what could be possible. And I think those are sometimes a friend of mine calls it butthead thinking. It's like, yeah, but we think of all the cynical, impossibilities and barriers, and we over-index on those rather than, dreaming into what's possible. Does that resonate with your observation, Sean?
Yeah, I can imagine it's vulnerable, right? Vulnerable, risky, or almost guaranteed to be wrong.
Got it.
To a certain degree.
Yeah, no doubt. And then, so that's scary, right? So it's putting out my personal vision of what I want to see happen. If, like you're saying, with the immense amount of uncertainty, these uncertain environments, we're kind of transforming the whole nature of the economy in a fast-moving social environment, then we are going to likely be wrong, or it's not going to be exactly like we want to dream it to be necessarily. Could be, but it's unlikely to be. And so that's really vulnerable and scary to say, like, okay, this is what I want to see. The challenge that we see is, like, a first challenge is developing a safe enough, a psychologically enough trusted space where somebody could be vulnerable and share what they want to see as possible, and then put it in a format or some type of container where we can actually like contrast and compare and start to find what are the patterns of alignment here.
So yeah, thanks, Kevin. So one of the things that we've seen helpful is, actually as a shared endeavor and a shared dilemma, saying kind of, hey, let's put it all out there. And then let's look together what's aligned and what's divergent, without this fear of, oh, we might have divergent things and that would be bad. We kind of approach it knowing, right, that we're each unique, distinct individuals. We have skills, talents, maybe different dreams, aspirations. There's going to be some element of divergence, and that's good. But what we're looking for in this process is which things are we going to invest in together, and then which things might be divergent, and we can just meet those needs or those visions in other aspects of our life. So there's a shared framing that, hopefully refers to this safety that you're talking about. It's like, it's okay if everything isn't 100% aligned. In fact, we need to get into that. We need to get into those details. And so there's a shared understanding of, hey, let's put it out there and let's look at it. And then, for example, one thing we often do is survey stakeholders ahead of a process or as kind of a lead into the process. And let's get out the things that each individual might want to see happen. And then let's look for those patterns and then present them back to the group. But it's not presented back as a final thing. It's presented back as, hey, these seem highly aligned. Would you all agree? And these elements seem potentially divergent. Would you agree? Or maybe there's some creativity around how the divergent elements are framed and they can actually be made into a coherent, shared element.
That's right, John. It's that process of making the implicit explicit and taking the time to process and reconcile or harmonize a vision, or you mentioned if there are divergences, to make space to, in some cases, those divergences might be bright lined enough or explicit enough, those divergences, that we can actually take a moment to publicly grieve and say, hey, that part of the vision is not something that is part of this group vision and the collective vision. And that's okay that you have that as part of your life impact that you want to have, but maybe there's a different place to express it. And that can be hard for the individual, but it makes it so that what's left in the center is truly opt-in. The second thing I'll add, and we can talk about this in a moment later, but once you have the makings of an aligned vision where there's an explicit opt-in aligned vision for the group, it doesn't mean it's written in stone or concrete and never to change again. That would be, foolish because of the comment before. We live in uncertain times, in an uncertain environment, a very dynamic environment. Things change, and our vision will adapt and change, and that can be a collective process. As I'm thinking about it, one thing that's really important, I'd be remiss in not saying, is, the requirement here of a psychologically safe or brave space, the requirement to have some amount of trust and shared analysis. Wherever there are domination culture, implicit power dynamics, these will oftentimes rear their head, or they'll show up in a collective visioning process. Meaning, those from a domination culture, oftentimes white men who might be involved as stakeholders in some way, their voice, because of the privilege of being able to think about what they want and what the world should be, or any bias they might place on their vision, even if it's oriented around impact, because of implicit power dynamics, those voices will oftentimes, present as power. And I think a very intentional, very important part of this process is to make sure that any implicit power dynamics are acknowledged and mitigated or dismantled in advance of finding a true opt-in. And that's not a one-time thing. That needs to be a continuous attention to make sure that the any domination culture dynamics don't pervade any collective visioning process.
Well, maybe we'll spend a minute on that because it's not a trivial consideration, right? Say I'm a founder and leader of a company, and then I want to circle up my staff and say, hey, what do you think about the vision? It might not be safe, or people might be afraid if they give a divergent opinion, that might affect their future in the company, right? So it's not just confined to the visioning process. What you're talking about is a dramatic restructuring of power systems, right? So if I'm the sole founder and owner, I can't just ask the staff of, hey, what do you all think? And then give them my vision, right? It's going to be a false invitation if they don't have power.
That's right. Sean, when we think about this visioning, the things we've seen over and over again when we've gone through these visioning processes, and we see alignment amongst individual visions and we see points of divergence, what would you say are some of the more common points of divergence, just to maybe ground this a little bit in some examples or types of examples of things that we see?
Sure. So sometimes we might think about how big of a team do you imagine on a certain horizon? Like in 10 years, how many staff will we have? Or how many locations? Or how much revenue? So kind of the scale of the operation. That's definitely one that jumps out that, can be, there could be a lot of differentiation among the staff, especially if we haven't, identified that previously.
Great example. Maybe I'll underscore if that's a really common one. So it's so awkward to talk to a team that is trying to do something new, say around, say, permanently affordable housing or some type of community-owned, community-controlled housing or some wonderful endeavor like that. And it's like, okay, you're starting now with maybe looking at, hey, we're going to get a property that we're going to acquire through community finance or and then have community owners. And it's awkward to talk about, where do you see this in 10 years or 20 years? And they're like, we're just starting on or first things first here, Kevin. We need to get the first property. We haven't talked about that or thought about that. And it's a strange thing that where that organization wants to be in 20 years or 10 years, for that matter, if there are strong divergences amongst the team, that is what we're talking about. So if somebody says, I imagine that we will have 1,000 properties in this bioregion under community control, community ownership, or permanent affordability, and then we will have replicated this model to 100 other bioregions within 10 years, or 100 other regions. That's a pretty big scale of endeavor, implying many people, accessing probably a significant amount of financing, developing skills and systems, maybe investments in different types of systems to be able to support that many projects. And somebody else on the project team was like, I was thinking that we would do 30 properties, in our town, or 10. And the detail there is really important depending on the width of the gap, the delta on the divergence, because there's so many implications every year of operations. What gets prioritized? Do we prioritize building the system to be able to replicate? Do we prioritize, really focusing in on quality? And for a couple of years, you might not notice the tensions, or they might be subtle. And then when you get to maybe with some success, some, level of development, all of a sudden it's like, oh, now we're starting to see some pretty extreme tension within the team and cultural conflicts emerging. And it's like, oh, what are those? Why are those there? And when a little bit of diagnostic, it's like, oh, we go back. We haven't really made it clear that there's some significant divergence on what impact we want to have in the world. Sean, what's another? That was one. What's another common divergence?
I guess another, and these might be the two most common ones, would be how much am I getting paid? What's my personal reciprocity for this? And this is kind of maybe less for some of the teams we work with, but in kind of business as usual economy is what's my exit strategy? Founders often think, hey, I'm going to start this up and then, I'll retire young or something. And so really important to parse those out because they could be very different, right? If I'm just planning to be a worker owner for a decade or so, and then maybe I'll move on to something else versus I think I'm gonna cash out and retire from this, and this is my retirement plan. So there's a wide spectrum of options there, and again, if they're not clearly articulated and aligned, it could be a real risk to have people kind of operating under different assumptions.
Yeah, well put. I think that we see lots of tensions emerging around, again, back to where you mentioned how there's a prerequisite of having a safe enough container, psychologically safe enough container to be able to share. This is what my expectations for reciprocity are in this endeavor, or these are what my needs are. I'm taking care of elders, I take care of my family. And, maybe I'm still largely immersed in the cash economy to mediate my needs. I have rent and pay for food. And so, my salary expectations would be XYZ. That could be a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, and then bringing it together as a team. So because it's so sensitive, sometimes it goes unspoken. And going unspoken, there's sometimes implicit expectations that aren't shared. And when they're not shared, maybe for a while, again, we'll just keep going. But then we reach a point where it's like, oh, now we have decisions to make about what to do with surplus, or we need to cut back on expenses in order to maintain viability and sustain. And that might have implications for compensation. And we can see co-ops or these very familiar and warm environments, conflict avoidance sometimes, where we just don't talk about those things. And then without talking about them, we run into big enough conflict that it actually can threaten the ability to continue. I do want to say more about that. It's not at all uncommon for us to find, within a group of founding team in a co-op or a next economy endeavor, to find a couple of people who are like, I'm hoping to be out of this in, 7 years or 10 years or 5 years. I want to give 5 years of my life to this, and then I do want to exit out. And there could be expectations around what exit means. Is that selling the organization? Is it getting a buyout from new co-op members in a succession plan? But if those expectations are not voiced early on, then they're not oftentimes planned for, and then it leads to these gnarly breakdowns and conflicts. And so it's not only the safe enough space to share those kind of things, there's also the acknowledgement. This is definitely true. It's hard to think about 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now in a highly uncertain environment where maybe you're still planning your life design and getting things together. It's why one of the former sessions in this series, we talked about life design, actually doing some form of life design and building up your structure and support systems around life design. We'll often say that's actually a prerequisite to being able to do effective organizational design. Obviously, there's a gradient there, and we're all starting at different places. That's why, as a theme, when we talk about vision alignment, iteration and revisioning is an important component. Maybe, Sean, do you want to elaborate on that piece, how that works?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to bring that in because, kind of bringing this topic in is why is the aligned vision so important? We want to get that enhanced sense of connection and purpose that we are actually aligned in not only our life purpose, but then specifically how we apply our life purpose to this shared enterprise. And as you're saying, if you haven't done any of that self-reflective work on what your life purpose is, it's going to be less resonant of why you're aligned with this particular enterprise. And so it does feed directly in, and that's why that was the preceding session to this one, right? So if anybody missed it, go back and listen to the previous session. And the other thing I was going to mention, just in terms of, the why is it so important or how we would use it, is not only would we have that enhanced sense of connection and purpose, but when we do have a rough, future-oriented alignment of the scale, the impact, what it's going to look like, etc., now we can start making our plans around that, right? And we can do decision making, we can do delegated authority, we can use it for recruiting, orientation, culture building, strategic partnerships. So, again, with how you started the session of, teams sometimes skip this. This is what we're trying to make the value proposition of why it's really worth it to have this kind of somewhat awkward, risky conversation to get really clear on these things, because when we get really clear on it, now we can be in action around it and we can be in coordination and in alignment around it. Would you add anything to that, Kevin?
I think there's a tremendous set of benefits that emerge, not just mitigating or avoiding conflict, but especially you mentioned the delegated authority. So a lot of next economy organizations aspire to be more horizontal in decision making, shared power, and to do those things without a organized, opt-in, explicit vision alignment creates a tremendous amount of risk. And you can notice it when you have an organization. The tension there, of course, is the word planning in general. Anybody who is trying these next economy organizations and trying to be transformative in the context of a business as usual economy are like, it's very difficult to plan. Our plans are almost inherently going to be wrong or off. There's just so much novelty and discovery because we're trying to do things differently. And that's right. So when we say planning, which we'll talk about in later sessions of this series, we often talk about setting goals along the lines of the vision as an orientation device and not a destination. So when we talk about planning, it doesn't necessarily mean, waterfall kind of, that we can chart a critical path and know the end state. Though those patterns of planning in less emergent novel environments are still very useful. It's very useful to be able to articulate what our best guess is about how things might evolve. Some people call that like a theory of change or a strategic plan, and have a set of steps and milestones. But the caution we have is once you have that set up aligned with the vision, so you have your impact vision, these are the impacts we want to create. This is our best guess is how we think it might evolve to get there. We're going to hold that very lightly in terms of the plan. We're going to have enough information with our vision and our goals to be able to take the next step, whatever the next step we think is. And then we're going to build in systems to check, hey, we took a step. Did that get us closer to oriented towards that thing? Has the thing changed? Has our vision changed? Do we want to reformat the goal? What's new at this moment? And just do that on a recursive, iterative, process-based basis so that it's a very dynamic and sense and respond and adaptive, but it's not without information. That there's a tension there, right, Sean? Have you noticed that come up?
Yeah, well, and what I hear too is instead of the focus being on we must achieve this goal at all costs and we're going to sacrifice, maybe psychological health or safety or impacts on the environment as we see in the business as usual case, what we're doing here, if I hear it correctly, is we're planning to revisit the vision and adapt as needed. So there's a focus on an iterative process and kind of reconvening with the team and reorienting based on what's happened rather than kind of a strict adherence to a set of milestones that kind of have to be achieved. So to me, it feels much more relational, right? To check back in with everybody and say, hey, how'd it go? We're all striving for these goals. How did we do? And, are we tracking closely enough? Maybe we need to do a monthly, right? Just check in on our annual goals, or maybe we're a little more mature and we're going seasonal or biannual, or maybe an annual retreat's enough.
Yeah, and I think that what you're pointing out there is the cadence or the rhythm of adaptation might depend. You use the word maturity or the stage of development of where if you're just starting, maybe it's early and often that you're iterating that vision, and maybe if you've been around as a co-op serving your bioregion for 20 years, maybe an annual cycle of revisioning is the kind of appropriate cadence. And of course, within the year pattern, you could have checkpoints as well. But there's time and attention invested in kind of the system of revisioning, reassessment, and iteration. And that I think that's where I can imagine somebody listening to this and thinking, like, this is all very abstract and kind of common sense. And I just wish it were commonly applied. I think there's so many barriers to actually doing this type of work. And what we see is the poles of either abdicate, like not doing any of it at all, which we mentioned as one of the traps. Like, okay, I don't need to plan. It's a dynamic world. We don't need to plan. We feel aligned enough. It feels right. So let's go ahead and just start working together with an implicit, alignment. The other, overcorrection that's definitely possible is kind of analysis paralysis and not finding those like safe to probe next steps. Like, what's the next step that we can actually go into action and get some feedback on? More like, let's just continually vision and overinvest in massive strategic planning efforts and raise money and capital just to do a business plan and big visioning documents, or a theory of change process with 28 steps and 9 months of stakeholder engagement. There's a right sizing to this effort, which I think is something that when we work one-on-one with companies tends to come out a lot.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Kevin, because one of the things we've seen successful there is some type of balance between going into this big picture vision in space and then kind of digging in or hitting the ground or putting it into action and kind of toggling back and forth, right? So like you mentioned, if we spent years just thinking and dreaming and maybe raising money and doing all kinds of research, I'm sure there's good work to be done on that scale. But if we're trying to launch a little company and keep ourselves employed, we might want to test some things and see if they can work, right? And so we have I guess a little bit of a bias towards that, at least not taking too long in just theoretical space without actually testing things or grounding it in reality. Certainly there's ways to do that with customer surveys, et cetera, where you're actually having interaction, but there's nothing like trying something, right? So, maybe a classic example would be for a food entrepreneur, instead of raising, significant capital and buying a building and doing huge improvements and graphic design and logos and all this stuff. Well, maybe make some of the food and pop up at a farmer's market and see if people like it. Does it sell? Tasties or something better or whatever. So you can get that real experience, real feedback. And it's this, I think we've called it like fail safe approach. Like you could afford for that one market to not be fully profitable because you've kind of budgeted it as a test. Rather on the previous example, where we're taking years to fundraise and plan. And then if that doesn't work, we might really disappoint some people and, have a higher cost of things not working out rather than if we plan to test in shorter cycles.
That's right. And so this right sizing of the effort, right sizing of the systems at Lift Economy in the facilitated Next Economy MBA and linked in the forthcoming book, we have a number of templates that we've developed to support teams in doing, visioning process to make explicit alignment, to seek out divergences, some process instructions about how to grieve those divergences, how to then write out and articulate, the vision of the organization, what's our shared analysis, what do we want to achieve, and then to store that in a place where it's accessible to all the stakeholders. One litmus test I'll use when working with a team, and I have the opportunity to meet with different stakeholders that are involved, I'll kind of ask so what is the vision? What are the goals for the organization? And maybe I'll use different words because there's a lot of semantic attachment to mission, vision, purpose, theory of change, and different words. And we're okay with, that these are all intending a lot of the same thing. Some of the differences may be important for some organizations, and some of those attachments are very thoughtful in kind of how they're developed. For us, the stark difference is when we see kind of no alignment or nothing that's articulated, or again, the far other pole where it's over-invested in. And so, but the litmus test is just asking, stakeholders, what do you think? What's the vision of this organization? And just hearing what they've said. You could do this as a test for the organization you're already working with and see how aligned it seems. Or, everybody says, here's our document that has our vision in it. This is what we mean. This is what we've agreed to in our last, retreat process. We all opted into this. That gives you a lot of confidence that wow, this group is really pulling in the same direction and has a process to be adaptive and iterate and understand what they're doing together. And whenever I see that, and we see that most often with those organizations that sustain. They're able to sustain their effort in these uncertain environments. Is that what you see, Sean?
Yeah, and I like how you frame that in kind of an open way, because the pattern that we're looking for here is there's enough kind of conversation that the alignment is enough to create functional plans and cooperate. So, we don't need teams to do it a certain way. It's just whether or not, like you're saying, if you ask somebody on the team, do they feel reasonably well oriented, and is the team performing and adapting as needed? And that's really what we're looking for. So this kind of right sizing of there's enough attention to this that we're paying attention, and syncing up and adapting as needed, but it's also kind of light or lean enough that people can kind of get to work and actually make some movement rather than thinking about it too much.
So there's a couple, before we wrap up about kind of the vision alignment steps, I do want to call out a big trapdoor. One of the major traps that next economy endeavors fall into is, in order to provide the goods and services they want for their community, they find themselves in a place where they need to raise capital. And by and large, depending on who the investors are, this is one of the places where we see a huge risk of divergence, where investors become a stakeholder in the organization. Maybe they're involved in governance or not, but they might have their own vision for what outcomes they want to see, and it's part of their business model as an investor, and that may or may not align with the vision that you've articulated. If you have not articulated your vision by the point where you raise capital, then almost always, with very few exceptions that I could think of, the vision for the company becomes the vision that the investors hold. This is, of course, not true if your investors are your community, or some of the things that we'll talk about in another session of this Next Economy Now MBA episodes, where we'll talk about alternative finance to the business as usual structures. But certainly in venture capital, venture private equity investment, as an example, if you don't have your vision clearly articulated in explicit alignment with those investors, the vision for the company and the impact it will have will be constrained by the vision that the investors have for their business model. And I wish I didn't have to be as blunt about it, but that's the pattern we see over and over again. So you want to make sure you're aware of that trapdoor.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Kevin. Yeah, we've seen people surprised and unfortunately influenced by taking on investment before they've had that vision and values clarity with investors. And so, yeah, please, so be strategy 2 fundraising. That'll come up later in this series. But yeah, it's an important consideration. And just to foreshadow a little bit, the coaching is to ground yourself in your vision and have that same rigor of vision alignment with the investors, and not just a caving or collapsing to the values and the vision of the investors, unless that's truly what you want. But as Kevin's saying, it's often radically different and really would limit or even completely prevent you from realizing your vision. So really, really important, brave conversation to have early. Well, Kevin, any last thoughts for our listeners here as we wrap up our vision alignment session?
Well, the only thing I'd say is for vision alignment, we mentioned critical success factor. And if you listen to this whole episode and you're like, oh, it still feels like common sense to me, that seems like almost business 101, I think the inflection of having an impact vision that comes from a place of shared power with an explicit check on domination power paradigms, and creating a vulnerable space for true alignment rather than a dictated vision. That's the one major difference that I'd say that is distinct from a business as usual context. And people aren't good at it. I mean, even though a lot of our consulting work, at least my consulting work, is maybe nuts and bolts sometimes around, building operating projections or leadership training or anything, market stuff. A lot of the pieces that I help work on, almost always in the process of working with an organization, we will work upstream at some point and, have some vision process check-in to make sure that the stakeholders that are, coming together to do something collaborative, which is, one of our advantages in a communitarian delegated authority kind of next economy approach, that we actually have that often, shared alignment. And it's just not as easy as, even if it's common sense, in my experience, it's just not as easy as some people would like to believe it is. Any last thoughts from you, Sean?
Yeah, well, what I would add to that is, you and I have done enough vision retreats with some of these teams, and while we're acknowledging it may be awkward and hard, also we've seen oftentimes people come out actually deeply inspired and sometimes changed from being invited in and being included and kind of entering into a powerful, vulnerable way of being with co-creators and team members that they never even realized was possible before. So definitely just encourage folks to be brave and explore explore these hard conversations because there's real benefit on the other side. And it comes out as teamwork and inspiration and actual results because you're actually pulling in the same direction. So highly worth investing in.
Amen. Thank you, Sean. And thanks all to the listeners. And, if you have any comments or questions on any of these topics, please reach out to us. We'd love to be in touch.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.